There comes a quiet point in time when the narcissist finally faces something deeply unsettling. It is not when you argue with them, not when you cry, and not even when you express how much they hurt you. It happens when they suddenly understand that you are truly gone. No messages, no explanations, no emotional reactions left behind, just silence. And in that silence, something changes inside them. A narcissist can tolerate your anger because anger still connects you to them. They can tolerate your sadness because it means they still matter in your world. They can even tolerate periods of silence if they believe you might return. But what they cannot cope with is the realization that you have actually moved on and will never come back. When that truth settles in their mind, it triggers behaviors they will never openly admit to anyone. Something very uncomfortable begins to happen beneath the surface when a narcissist understands that your life has truly continued without them. You are not taking space, you are not waiting for an apology, and you are not hoping they will change. You are simply gone in a way that means your future no longer revolves around them. When that awareness finally sinks in, a quiet obsession often begins behind the scenes. Narcissists rely heavily on attention and emotional reactions to feel powerful. For a long time, you acted like a mirror reflecting their importance back to them. Your texts, your concern, your efforts to fix the relationship all reinforced their sense of control. But when you step away completely and stop explaining yourself, stop reacting, and stop chasing them for closure, that mirror disappears. Suddenly, they are left facing a silence they do not understand. Without that reflection, they begin observing from afar. It rarely happens openly or honestly. Instead, it happens quietly and indirectly. They may scroll through your social media late at night when no one is watching. They might check the profiles of mutual friends just to see if you appear in a photo. Sometimes they casually bring your name into conversation with others, acting as though they are simply curious or indifferent. But behind that casual tone, they are searching for something very specific. They want to find proof that leaving them ruined your life. They hope to see sadness, struggle, or signs that things became harder for you after they were gone. Seeing that would restore their belief that they were always the center of your world and that you could never truly thrive without them. But the moment that truly unsettles them happens when they look from a distance and discover something they never expected to see: peace. Imagine them opening a photo and noticing you smiling in a way they have not seen before. You might be surrounded by friends, exploring new places, building a life that no longer includes them. They see you traveling, growing, achieving goals, laughing freely, and suddenly a question begins echoing in their mind, a question they never thought they would have to confront. What if you are actually happier without them? That single thought shakes them more than anger ever could. Anger means you still care. Arguments mean they still occupy space in your emotional world. But happiness without them represents something far more threatening. It means they have lost control completely. Many people who escape toxic relationships later discover that their former partner continued watching their life quietly for years. They check occasionally, observe from the background, and try to make sense of how the person they once manipulated managed to become stronger after leaving. What they struggle to understand is actually very simple. When you stop performing for someone who thrives on control, your entire life begins to change. Your confidence slowly rebuilds, your energy returns, your attention shifts toward creating a life that feels meaningful instead of constantly trying to repair a relationship that was always breaking you down. That transformation becomes visible in ways they cannot ignore, even if they pretend otherwise. So while they may act as if you never mattered, and while they may tell others that moving on was easy for them, the reality behind the scenes can look very different. Often there is a quiet observation happening that no one talks about, not because they suddenly appreciate your value, but because they cannot understand how someone they once controlled found the strength to walk away and never return. That is where the real power of your freedom appears. It is not loud or dramatic. It does not require revenge or proving anything. Your growth becomes the answer by itself. Your peace speaks without needing explanation. And from a distance, whether they admit it or not, they are forced to witness something they never believed could happen. A life where you no longer need them in order to feel complete. Another revealing shift begins once the narcissist accepts that you are not coming back. They start quietly rewriting the story of the past. Not the real story you experienced, the one filled with arguments late at night, emotional confusion, manipulation, and apologies that never led to real change. That version of the past is too threatening for them to face. Instead, they begin constructing a different narrative, one where they are never the one at fault. For a narcissist, the truth can feel dangerous because it challenges the carefully crafted image they present to the world. The real story exposes the cracks behind the charm, the control hidden beneath the charisma, and the manipulation disguised as affection. When you leave permanently, your absence becomes proof that something about their behavior was deeply wrong. And for someone whose identity depends on appearing perfect, admired, and superior, that realization becomes almost impossible to accept. So the story slowly begins to change. At some point, they begin presenting a completely different version of the past to the people around them. The story slowly changes depending on who is listening. They might say that you were overly emotional or that you created constant tension. Sometimes they describe you as unstable, impossible to satisfy, or someone who always caused problems in the relationship. In their version of events, they become the patient one who tried their best, while you were the person who pushed everything to the edge. To people who never witnessed what truly happened behind closed doors, that explanation can sound convincing. This is one of the ways narcissists defend their ego. They do not correct their behavior or reflect on their actions. Instead, they reshape the story so that it protects the image they want others to see. Think about someone who spent years controlling the emotional environment of a relationship. They decided when affection appeared and when it disappeared. They chose when warmth was offered and when silence was used as a form of punishment. Now imagine that same person being forced to explain why the person they once controlled suddenly walked away and never returned. Accepting the truth would mean admitting that their own behavior drove someone away. For a narcissistic mind, that kind of responsibility feels like a collapse of their identity. Their entire self-image is built around appearing admirable and faultless. So rather than face that painful reality, they create a protective barrier made from distorted stories and half-truths that allow them to avoid accountability. What is fascinating about this behavior is that it actually reveals their deepest insecurity. When someone genuinely believes they did nothing wrong, they rarely spend enormous energy defending themselves or reshaping the narrative. But when a narcissist repeatedly retells and adjusts the story to protect their reputation, it exposes the fear underneath. The louder the defense becomes, the clearer it shows how threatened they feel by the truth. And while they are busy explaining themselves and carefully adjusting their version of events to preserve their image, something far more meaningful is happening in your life. You are moving forward. You are slowly healing from emotional exhaustion that may have lasted for years. You are rediscovering the person you were before manipulation and confusion began reshaping your sense of self. Many people who leave toxic relationships eventually hear rumors about themselves. They may learn that their former partner told others exaggerated or distorted stories that portray them as unstable or ungrateful. In the beginning, hearing those things can feel incredibly painful. It feels unfair and deeply frustrating because it can seem like another attempt to control the narrative. But something interesting often happens over time. People start noticing patterns. They begin to realize that the narcissist tells a similar story about nearly everyone who eventually leaves them. As that pattern becomes visible, the narrative begins losing its influence because the truth slowly reveals itself through repetition and consistency. That is where your strength becomes undeniable. You do not need to chase every rumor or correct every distorted story. Trying to fight every accusation only keeps you connected to the same chaos you worked so hard to escape. Instead, your character speaks for itself over time. Your calmness contradicts their accusations. Your growth gradually makes their stories sound smaller and less believable. The most powerful response to someone rewriting history is not another argument or public defense. It is living a life so genuine and peaceful that the truth becomes visible without explanation. While they struggle to protect an illusion, you continue moving forward with something much stronger than any story they could create. You move forward with reality. Another moment that often feels confusing and deeply painful comes when someone who left a narcissistic partner notices how quickly that person appears to move on. Sometimes it seems almost immediate. Only a short time passes and suddenly there are new photos, new attention, or even a new relationship with someone standing exactly where you once stood. Seeing that can trigger a flood of painful questions. You may begin wondering if the love you experienced was ever real. You may question whether you truly mattered at all. It can feel impossible to understand how someone could replace you so quickly after everything you shared together. With time and distance, many people eventually discover an important truth that explains this behavior. The narcissist is not truly replacing you as a person. What they are trying to replace is the emotional supply you provided. For someone with narcissistic patterns, relationships often revolve less around genuine emotional connection and more around validation, admiration, and control. The attention you gave them, the reassurance you offered, and the emotional energy you invested all acted like fuel for their ego. Those things help them feel powerful and important. When that fuel suddenly disappears, it creates a void they cannot comfortably sit with. Instead of facing that emptiness, they rush to fill it. That urgency pushes them to search quickly for someone new who can provide the same admiration and attention. They often look for someone who has not yet seen their patterns or experienced their manipulation. To the new person, the narcissist may appear charming, confident, and incredibly captivating. They present the same carefully crafted version of themselves that once drew you in. Compliments may feel intense and constant. The connection may appear unusually strong and exciting. Everything can feel almost perfect in the beginning. That phase is often known as idealization, and it serves a very specific purpose. It pulls a new person into the relationship quickly, so the narcissist can restore the sense of admiration and control they lost when you left. However, there is one thing they cannot escape no matter how quickly they move forward. Patterns repeat. The same behaviors that eventually caused pain in your relationship slowly begin appearing again. Emotional distance starts creeping in. The need for control returns. Subtle criticism and manipulation gradually replace the early charm. Many people who once felt devastated watching their former partner move on quickly later hear the same stories from someone new. The same confusion, the same emotional exhaustion, and the same realization that the charming person from the beginning was only a mask that could not stay in place forever. That is the moment when everything becomes clear. While the narcissist continues repeating the same cycles with different people, you have the chance to step completely outside of that pattern. You are not rushing to fill an empty space in your life. Instead, you are rebuilding your world with care and intention. You are learning what healthy connection actually looks like. You are rediscovering your independence, your worth, and the sense of peace that may have been missing for a long time. That difference matters more than it may seem in the moment. Moving quickly into another relationship might look like strength from the outside, but speed is not healing. More often, speed is simply a way to escape uncomfortable emotions. Real healing takes patience. It requires reflection and the courage to understand what happened and grow from it. While they rush forward trying to recreate the same dynamic with someone new, you are moving in a completely different direction. You are evolving. And one day, when you look back at the moment that once caused so much pain, you may realize something truly powerful about the path you chose. In time, you come to realize something powerful about what you gave. You were never something that could simply be swapped out or replaced. What you brought into the relationship was genuine. It came from sincerity, from real care, from an honest emotional connection. And that kind of connection cannot simply be recreated by someone who never truly understood its value in the first place. There is also a moment that very few people talk about, a moment that happens quietly inside the mind of a narcissist when they begin to recognize that something has changed for good. It is not a temporary shift driven by emotion or anger. It is the moment they start realizing that you are not coming back at all. That realization does not arrive suddenly. It grows slowly as the silence continues, and the familiar cycle they relied on never begins again. For a long time, a narcissist moves through relationships with a strong belief about the people around them. They assume that eventually everyone returns. No matter how much conflict happened or how deeply someone was hurt, they believe time, charm, or manipulation will eventually pull that person back. This belief becomes part of the protection they build around their ego. It allows them to behave carelessly with other people's emotions because they assume the door will always stay open. But then something unusual happens when it comes to you. In the beginning, they believe your silence is temporary. They assume you are simply upset or trying to prove a point. Maybe they think you just need space before the cycle starts again. They expect a message, an emotional reaction, or another late conversation that gives them the chance to pull you back into their orbit. As the weeks stretch into months, that expectation slowly begins to weaken. The familiar signals they relied on never appear. There are no emotional messages waiting to restart the cycle. The arguments that once kept the connection alive never return. The reactions they expected to provoke from you are completely absent. Gradually, a disturbing thought begins forming in their mind. You are not pausing, you are not waiting, you are simply gone. This realization triggers something psychologists sometimes describe as an internal collapse of the ego. It is not something dramatic that happens in public. There are no loud confessions or obvious breakdowns. Instead, it is a quiet fracture in the image they carefully built about themselves. The narcissist's identity is often built around the belief that they are unforgettable and impossible to truly leave behind. They see themselves as the center of every story, the person who ultimately controls how relationships begin and end. For years, they may have believed they could push someone away and then pull them back whenever they wanted. Suddenly, that belief faces something it cannot explain. Someone broke the pattern. Someone stepped out of the cycle entirely, and an uncomfortable question begins forming in their mind. What if they actually lost control this time? They will almost never speak this thought out loud. To others, they may appear completely confident. They might act indifferent, even dismissive, pretending the situation barely crosses their mind. Inside, however, the story they once believed about themselves begins to crack. Someone saw through the performance. Someone recognized the manipulation and the emotional games that once worked so effectively. Instead of fighting harder or begging for change, that person made a quiet decision. They walked away and closed the door behind them. Losing control of someone they once believed emotionally belonged to them is one of the most unsettling experiences for a narcissistic ego. It challenges the illusion of power they relied on for so long. Many people who left toxic relationships eventually discover years later that this shift did occur. Through mutual friends or passing conversations, they learn that their former partner still mentions them occasionally, or still tries to understand why they never came back. It is not because the narcissist suddenly developed deep empathy or understanding. It is because they encountered something they were not prepared for. Their illusion of control was broken. That realization lingers in a way they rarely admit to anyone. It becomes the one relationship that did not follow the script they expected. This is where your strength becomes impossible to deny. You did something many people struggle to do. You refused to continue playing the role that had been assigned to you. Instead of staying inside the emotional cycle, you stepped completely outside of it. You chose dignity instead of endless conflict. You chose calm over chaos and clarity over confusion. Once you make that choice, something important begins to happen inside your own life. You start reclaiming the identity that may have been buried beneath manipulation and emotional exhaustion. Little by little, you stop measuring your value based on someone else's approval. You stop trying to earn love from someone who only understood how to control it. You begin building a life where your sense of worth is no longer dependent on another person's validation. That shift is the real victory. While they may never openly acknowledge the fracture their ego experienced, the reality remains clear. For perhaps the first time in their life, someone walked away from their game and never returned. Even after months pass and your silence remains unbroken, something inside them often refuses to fully accept that the connection is truly finished. A part of them continues believing the cycle might still restart someday. This is where a subtle and calculated behavior can begin to appear, something many people fail to recognize at first because it does not always look obvious or dramatic on the surface. Psychologists often describe this next behavior with the term hoovering. In simple words, it is the narcissist's quiet attempt to pull you back into their emotional world. What makes it interesting is that these attempts almost never appear dramatic or obvious. They rarely come with deep apologies or honest admissions of regret. Instead, they show up in subtle ways that seem casual on the surface. You might receive a short message that looks harmless at first glance. Something simple like saying they were thinking about you and hoping you are doing well. The words may appear polite and neutral, but beneath them sits a very specific intention. It is not really about concern. It is about testing whether the emotional connection still exists and whether they can still reach you the way they once did. Sometimes the signal arrives through something even smaller. They might suddenly react to an old photo you posted months ago, leaving a like or a quiet digital reminder that they are still aware of your life. Other times, the contact happens indirectly through mutual friends. Someone might casually mention that the narcissist asked about you or brought up your name in a conversation. Each of these gestures may seem insignificant on its own, but together they reveal a clear pattern. The narcissist is quietly checking the door. In their mind, emotional bonds never fully disappear. They believe that with the right amount of nostalgia, curiosity, or shared memories, they can reopen the connection whenever they want. Often their goal is not even to rebuild the relationship entirely. What they truly want is reassurance that they still have access to your emotions. Think about how powerful that influence once was. There may have been a time when a single message from them could instantly change your mood. One text could pull you into a long conversation, an argument, an apology, or another emotional cycle that kept repeating. For a narcissist, that kind of influence becomes addictive because it reinforces their sense of control. When you leave and maintain your silence, that control disappears. Suddenly they face something they are not comfortable with: uncertainty. That uncertainty pushes them to send these small signals. A message here, a reaction there, a sudden reminder of shared memories. Each one is like dropping a small stone into still water just to see if the surface moves. They are watching carefully to see if ripples appear. If you respond emotionally, even if that response comes in the form of anger or explanation, the narcissist receives the confirmation they were hoping for. It tells them the emotional door is still open. It shows them they still occupy space in your thoughts and feelings. But when something different happens, when their attempt meets calm indifference or complete silence, the entire dynamic shifts. Your silence begins to communicate something powerful. It is not the silence of pain or confusion anymore. It becomes the silence of clarity and boundaries. Many people who leave toxic relationships describe this exact moment. Months later, a message appears that feels friendly or nostalgic, and the temptation to respond can feel strong. Memories begin whispering in those moments. But when they choose not to respond and hold their boundaries, something remarkable unfolds. Eventually, the attempts begin to fade. The narcissist slowly realizes something they never wanted to believe. The door is no longer open. That realization changes everything. Your strength becomes undeniable, not because you argued louder or tried harder to prove your point, but because you mastered something far more difficult. You learned emotional discipline. You understood that peace sometimes requires silence, and that real boundaries often require distance. In many situations, the strongest response to manipulation is simply the absence of a response. In that quiet strength, you take back control of your life. And for the first time, the narcissist finds themselves standing outside a door they can no longer open. There is also another truth that rarely gets discussed, yet it quietly lingers in the background of many narcissistic relationships long after they end. A narcissist may encounter many people throughout their life. They may charm some, discard others, and repeat the same emotional patterns again and again. But every so often, there is one person who leaves a deeper mark than the rest. One person whose absence creates a memory that does not fade as easily. That person is often the one who finally recognized the truth and walked away. Most individuals who encounter a narcissist never fully understand what they are dealing with. They stay longer than they should because they believe the love they experienced in the beginning will eventually return. They keep trying to repair the relationship by communicating more clearly, loving more deeply, or sacrificing more of themselves in the hope that the connection will transform into something stable and genuine. But you reached a different point in your journey. You arrived at a moment of clarity when everything suddenly made sense. The emotional fog lifted, and the pattern became impossible to ignore. The manipulation, the constant push and pull, the endless need for validation, and the subtle ways your confidence was slowly being worn down all began to connect. What once felt confusing finally revealed its true shape. And in that moment of understanding, you chose something many people struggle to choose. You chose to step away. Instead of staying trapped in that exhausting pattern, you made a decision that changed everything. You chose yourself. You stopped pleading for someone to finally understand what you were feeling. You stopped trying to explain your pain to a person who never truly listened. You stopped chasing the version of them that only existed during the early stage of the relationship, the version that seemed kind, attentive, and full of promises. Most importantly, you stopped pouring your emotional energy into someone who only knew how to take from you without giving the same care in return. That decision is not easy for most people to make. Walking away from a cycle that once felt meaningful requires strength and clarity. Because of how rare that choice is, it leaves a deeper impact than you may realize. The narcissist will almost never admit this openly. Their pride and self-image will not allow them to say they lost someone important. Instead, they may act as if the relationship meant very little to them. They might tell others it was never serious or claim that they were the one who moved on first. From the outside, it may look like they erased the connection completely. But beneath that performance, a quiet awareness often remains. You stood out in a way they rarely experience. Not because you were perfect and not because the relationship was flawless, but because you loved sincerely and eventually recognized the truth. You offered qualities that cannot easily be replaced. You showed empathy, patience, and emotional depth. When you finally withdrew that energy, the absence of it created a silence that no new connection could completely fill.